All right, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar with EOPA, Elected Officials to Protect America, and Offshore Wind. We'll be getting started in just a moment. My name is Dominic Frangillo. I'm a co-founder and executive director of Elected Officials to Protect America. We're a network of state and local elected officials across the country on calling for a bold response, solving the climate emergency, and ensuring environmental justice and protecting our lands and waters. And as a network, as current and former elected officials, we believe that public elected officials are public servants and public stewards of our communities, of our democracy, and of our planet, and that there are crises and challenges that arise that require us as public servants to step up and lead in the climate emergency, environmental injustice, and the threats of pollution from fossil fuels among them in particular. And by joining together across jurisdictions, across levels of office, across jurisdictional boundaries, and across states, that we can join together and actually help lead policy solutions to these problems. So that's why we're so excited to welcome you here today to our webinar series for local elected officials in New York and New Jersey to learn about offshore wind, which is an increasing big topic, an important opportunity for our state. So many of us who have been elected to office have questions about this and want to know what are some policy solutions moving forward. So this is a two-part series. The first part, this webinar today, will be focused on the environmental and technological considerations of offshore wind, how wind farms, offshore wind farms work, what are the environmental effects associated with their construction, their operation, what are some policy solutions at the state, local, and federal levels that we should be aware of so that we can help direct this increasing opportunity in the best possible way. The next in the series will, on March 1st at 5:30 p.m., will be on the economic and workforce benefits of offshore wind. And those are, what are the benefits economically for communities and for our states, and what are some of the policy solutions on workforce development, manufacturing, supply chain to make sure that our communities benefit from this, and that offshore wind, when done, is done right for the people, for our communities, and for the environment as well, and ensuring environmental justice. So with no further ado, I'd love to get started on today's webinar, which is, again, what are the technological and environmental considerations of offshore wind? And we're so excited to chat and with our esteemed panelists today. But just a little bit of background. The planet has been dealing with catastrophic weather extremes. And so we know that we need to stop using fossil fuels. Offshore wind is a key player in that, not just decarbonizing the power grid, but also in many opportunities in greening fuels, for example, like hydrogen, that could get some of the harder to reduce emission sectors like cargo shipping, aviation, and steelmaking, and others. Bloomberg, as an example, said that the world is on track to hit 504 gigawatts in installations by 2035. That's a 10-fold increase from 2021, last year, 2 years ago. So that's, we're still stuck in the pandemic now. So that's a huge increase in this industry. So how can we best be prepared as policymakers to deal with that? And offshore wind in the United States alone has the potential to produce more than 2,000 gigawatts of offshore wind in the United States. That's twice the current generation, electric generation of the entire US energy grid. So this is a huge contributor to greening the infrastructure and electricity grid of the United States. And New England, the Northeast in particular, can generate, offshore wind alone can generate 5 times the amount of our current electricity demand with offshore wind alone. That's the kind of clean electricity generation opportunity that offshore wind has. It's one of the biggest levers that we can pull to grow our economy, create jobs, and meet our energy needs, and is poised to be a $1 trillion industry by 2040 to create thousands of jobs, provide clean energy here at home, and spurring economic growth. And it's a new industry, and we have a lot of questions, and there's other places around the world where it's been done. We want to know as elected officials, policymakers, where has this been done right? Where has it not been done right? What are some of the considerations? What are some of the concerns? And what are some of the questions that we need to be asking as policymakers to ensure that this industry is done right in our states? So with that background setting the stage, very excited to introduce our esteemed panelists. We will start off with a presentation on technology and technology aspects of offshore wind with Georges Sassine, who's the Vice President of Large-Scale Renewables at NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. So with no further ado, I'll pass it over to Georges.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We appreciate being with you here this afternoon. My name is George Sassine. I'm the VP for Large-Scale Renewables at NYSERDA, which is the clean energy state agency for the state of New York. I cover any renewable projects above 10 megawatts in the state, including offshore wind, but also land-based renewables and transmission projects, energy storage, and many others. I have some slides I'd like to share with you today. I don't know if somebody's going to share them, or should I be sharing my screen? Perfect. So go to the next slide, please. So I just want to like anchor the conversation when it comes to offshore wind in New York and renewables in general. The North Star for all our work here in New York is the New York Climate Act. What we call the CLCPA law. And basically what the law mandates us to do is to get to 70% renewable electricity by 2030 and a zero emission grid by 2040. And with these very ambitious goals, the law has set very specific targets for various technologies that New York would have to advance in order to reach these overarching goals. And as part of that, offshore wind in New York, we have a goal of 9 gigawatts by 2035. And it's going to be very likely that this goal is going to grow beyond that, as we've been doing a lot of analysis into like what would it take to achieve the goals of the Climate Act, of the New York Climate Act. And some analysis is coming back saying we're going to need as much as 16 to 18 gigawatts by 2040 or 2050 of offshore wind if we really want to decarbonize the state of New York, and specifically, Manhattan and New York City, which are really the largest demand center for electricity for the whole state of New York, and one of the largest demand centers in the world, if you'd like. So offshore wind provides one of the best options to decarbonize, Manhattan and New York City. So with that in mind, that's like our North Star that's guiding all the work that we're doing. And I don't know if you can go to the next slide, please. And I want to put things in perspective a little bit. When we talk about offshore wind, like these are massive infrastructure projects. Like if you look at this chart, I love this chart that shows you some of these like early on offshore wind technologies. And this is, like we have an example of some of the latest technologies, and they're getting bigger and bigger by the day. But some of the latest offshore wind turbines are, significantly larger than the Statue of Liberty and about, half the size of the Empire State Building. These are massive infrastructure projects. And just imagine what it would take just to manufacture these and transport some of these, putting this on a truck or on a boat to get them, very deep into the ocean, like what it would take to install these. It's just massive. And then automatically think about what it would require, from a manufacturing and supply chain perspective, and the amount of jobs that would create to do this. So I really like this chart, puts things in perspective when we talk about all these different opportunities and how big of an endeavor and how wonderful of an engineering feat that humans are doing by developing these technologies and tapping into these offshore high wind speeds and generate electricity out of them. If we could move to the next slide, please. What I want to do here is really just try to talk about the different roles that the federal government play versus the state versus the private sector and the industry role, and we all need to be working together to bring these visions to reality. And there's as part of the federal government and the uh, you know the an agency called the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is called BOEM, and you can think of them as basically the landlords of the water and the lease areas in the ocean. So it's the federal government. Like, we're going so deep into the ocean that it's basically these are owned by the federal government, not by the state. These are federal waters, and so the federal government basically identifies these lease areas specifically for offshore wind development, and they oversee issuing the federal permitting processes for these areas. And after the federal government does that, the states would come into play, and this is where agencies like NYSERDA would then go in and select the offshore wind projects and run solicitations, and that would have a competitive process where we get the bids from the private sector, from private companies, and so we would select the best offshore wind projects to deliver the energy that New York needs. Again, in a competitive procurement process perspective, and we would be coordinating and collaborating with other state agencies, across the state that would be providing different perspectives and lenses and support in helping us make the best decisions for New Yorkers. And then the private sector, the private sector developers, they're going to be responsible for designing and building and financing and operating these projects over 25 plus years, right? So it's a and this is like at a high level, but it's a very deep ecosystem of stakeholders that have to operate and collaborate together to make this happen. If we can go to the next slide, I just want to put things in perspective a little bit. Obviously New York is not the alone in advancing offshore wind, and it's just for the U.S. in general. The White House has issued a goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. New York right now has a goal of 9 gigawatts by 2035, but New Jersey has a goal of 11 gigawatts. And so that is, and a lot of different states along the East Coast also, have some very ambitious goals. So when you put all these together, when you aggregate the demand, you're really talking about like a very large market for offshore wind that's really going to be the core driver to create a US based supply chain and workforce to support the build out of this industry. It's a big economic driver, an economic development driver. And what we're doing is really creating the market and the demand to drive all these investments, not only in New York, but across the East Coast and across the US. If we can go to the next slide. So right now in New York, we have the largest pipeline of projects are being developed live as we speak. We have 5 projects that are being developed, a total of 4.3 gigawatts of projects that we expect to create more than 6,800 direct jobs over 25 years. And they're going to, combine, we're talking about like more than $12 billion of investments in New York. So we're very, very excited and very proud of this pipeline of projects that are being developed. And again, we almost have like a first mover advantage, but really we're really ahead in many respects here in New York in developing the offshore wind industry, and we take a lot of pride in it, and a lot of pride in sharing best practices with other neighboring states that are trying to follow suit. Next slide. So I wanted to just note, where all these projects that I just talked about are located on the map, and you can see, the the dotted red line is the proposed interconnection on how they would bring the electricity to shore, and where these would land. So you can see that Empire Wind 1 is the closest project to New York shoreline. It's going to be 15 miles south of Jones Beach, and it's the closest point. But the projects like South Fork Wind and Sunrise Wind, these are going to be more than 30 miles away from shore. So we're talking like really, I know this map makes things look very small, but these are really, really very large and long distances that we're talking about. So while the turbines are going to be half the size of the Empire State Building, they're so far off the coast that they would not be visible. So we can go to the next slide, please. So with all of these projects, building the port infrastructure, the manufacturing infrastructure, the supply chain is really critical to help us achieve our goals and build these projects. And specifically with what's happening in Europe, Europe's, similar to the US, has very ambitious and aggressive goals for offshore wind. And a lot of the traditional supply chain for offshore wind is located there because they've been ahead of the US in developing that industry. And so this supply chain has already been set up there. But there's so much demand, and given what's happening in Europe right now with Russia and Ukraine, there's even more demand for accelerating the development of offshore wind that I don't want to say desperately, but we've extremely need the development of a local offshore wind supply chain here in the US. And in New York, we're prioritizing the development of that supply chain in New York, and we have the ambition of being at the hub of offshore wind supply chain for the East Coast and for the rest of the US. So right now we have, the state has we've invested with the private sector about $700 million in developing our port infrastructure. We have a lot of different projects are being built as we speak. And I'll come to that later, but we're also investing $500 million, in the next few months and a couple of years, and developing even further the supply chain in Europe. But I'll come to that in a minute. If we can go to the next slide, please. And so basically, in order for us to create the market for offshore wind, what we do is we send very clear signals to the market with regards to our solicitation. So every 2 years, we run a solicitation where we acquire a few offshore wind projects. So we have a very regular and certain cadence so that we can attract the best companies in the world to come and be interested in the market here and invest here. So creating that certainty and that rhythm and that cadence is really critical in creating a vibrant and market that the private sector can rely on. Next slide, please. So a few weeks ago on basically I think almost a month ago, given that we're on February 23rd, we received bids to the third offshore wind solicitation in New York. We've evolved our solicitation and how it's designed significantly from the last round a couple of years ago. It has gotten much more sophisticated as we've learned and evolved our procurement processes. One of the key things that we've done is this second bullet point on the left that I really want to highlight and insist on. As you're building the offshore wind project, what's really important also is to build what I call the ocean grid, like the transmission grid that connects all these different offshore wind projects to each other. And there are the various visions that thinking beyond just New York and New Jersey, just thinking about potentially building a backbone and a transmission grid across the East Coast that would connect all these different offshore wind projects together. So what we call a meshed grid, right? There'd be a grid that would connect with each other across the East Coast. And given that we have not reached a final decision with all these different stakeholders about building a meshed grid, but we would like to keep the option open to build a meshed grid. What we've done is we've mandated that all the projects that would bid in to us would create what we call a meshed ready grid. And basically it's building the minimum amount of infrastructure. Basically think about it like in simple terms, like building the hooks into the project, that if in the future we decide to connect these projects to each other, the minimum amount of infrastructure is already in place from the beginning. And by doing this, we would be saving $60 million a year, by basically proactively and preemptively building this infrastructure instead of having to build it later on. So this is just one example of some of the things that we've done in this RFP. And we have received a record amount of proposals and interest that we've never seen in the US before. So I'll give you an example. Maybe a couple of years ago, we received maybe around 19 to 20 proposals. This time around, we received more than 100. So that shows you the unprecedented level of interest that we've attracted from global companies that would want to come and do business here in New York and here in the US and help us achieve our really ambitious goals with regards to offshore wind. So very, very exciting and a big testament of all the hard work of a lot of people, a lot of agencies, including NYSERDA, in making this happen. Next slide, please. So like I mentioned earlier, as part of developing the offshore wind industry, it's really critical to develop the supply chain. And so with Governor Hochul has allocated $500 million that the state would be co-investing with the private sector to develop the offshore wind supply chain here in New York. And so the way we're approaching it is we're dividing up this money in 3 stages. The first stage is married with this current RFP that I just talked about, where we actually encouraged the private sector developers that said they're going to build the offshore wind generation projects, but to also partner with some key supply chain manufacturers to come and manufacture, key investments, whether it's the blades that would go into the turbines, or it would be the cables, or it would be the ports, etc. So really the big major supply chain and manufacturing investments, and be paired with basically their end customers, right? So whoever these manufacturers are would end up selling the equipment that would go into building these projects for New York. So we've allocated $300 million for these big investments. Then we said after this RFP, we're going to allocate around $150 million for projects that would basically have a plan B, an option B, to resubmit their proposals in case they didn't partner with the right developer that would have won. And then after that, we've allocated $50 million to invest into tier 2 and tier 3 subcontracting manufacturing that would basically feed into these larger investments. So we're trying to build an ecosystem across the value chain for supply chain. And I'm getting a 2-minute warning, so I'm going to try to accelerate the next slides if you don't mind. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So if you haven't picked up on what I'm trying to say, really, it's not only about procuring the cheapest electricity and electrons, but we're trying to really accomplish multiple goals. We're trying to really, and what we're doing, we're really trying to make sure that we develop the supply chain. We want to get the best deals for ratepayers. We do want to engage with different stakeholders and make sure that they're included in the energy transition, et cetera, et cetera. So we're trying to really design our procurement in a way that really hits on many different points. If you can go to the next slide, please. Obviously, training and having the right talent is critical. So having the right workforce to actually help us build these projects on time is going to be critical. So we're investing a lot of money in workforce training initiatives. You can see some of the highlights here. I'm short on time, so I'm going to try to zoom through the rest. If we can go to the next slide, if you don't mind. And so we've actually a few weeks ago launched a new website that would allow anybody that's trying to look for jobs in this industry to identify the right opportunities and the right training to upskill and be able to qualify to take some of these jobs on. So we're trying to really enable anybody and everybody to be part of this clean energy transition. And if we can go to the next slide, please. Next one, I think that also the next one, just try to wrap this up. I think I really want to highlight what comes next for offshore wind here in New York. What we're doing is we're launching the second round of our master planning, basically looking at deeper waters, going beyond 60 meters to be able to unlock additional lease areas and be able to build even further beyond the 9 gigawatts by 2035 goal. So we're kickstarting this work right now, and it might take a couple of years to be able to define basically new lease areas to expand on what we're already doing here in New York. So very busy here and a lot more to come, and happy to answer any questions you may have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, George, for presenting that very insightful presentation. I've learned a lot myself, including just how big these turbines are for scale, and then all of the different roles and that different players have in this. I think that really speaks to the importance of us learning and getting clear on that. And for questions, we will we'll have Q&A after folks, after all of our panelists go through. Please drop your questions in the chat, and we will get to them after all of our presenters. So we will move on to our next speaker. And since we're talking about technology and the environmental impacts and benefits of offshore wind, we just heard a little bit about the technology side. We'll next go to hear about the environmental considerations. So with that, go to a wildlife expert, Amber Hewlett, who's a program director with Offshore Wind Energy with the National Wildlife Federation. Amber, take it away.
So National Wildlife Federation launched our offshore wind program in 2010, 2011, and the downfall of the Waxman-Markey climate bill. As a national conservation organization, we were trying to figure out what the next chapter of our offshore wind work would look like, or sorry, the next chapter of our climate work would look like. And in the Northeast region, offshore wind really jumped off the map as something that had significant, abundant, untapped climate potential. There's already a pretty advanced offshore wind industry around the world, even a decade ago. And we just weren't getting any of it in the US. And I join you today from my hometown of Newburyport, Massachusetts, on the North Shore of Massachusetts. Here, growing up here, living in Massachusetts, I felt like I heard the offshore wind debate playing out for my entire life, and we still don't have a single turbine to show for it. So I started my time at National Wildlife Federation a little over 10 years ago, and was very excited to hear that we were starting an offshore wind program at that time, jumped on board and never looked back. So I am just going to share a bit about how we approach this work, and would look forward to answering questions, but there's a ton that we could talk about tonight. So this will be a very quick overview. We most importantly approach our work with a lot of conditions and caveats. We are first and foremost a wildlife organization, a conservation organization, and we are a federation of 52 state affiliates. So we are governed by experts on the ground in their region on what conservation means in each and every state across the country. And we are always expanding our definition of responsible development. Our support for offshore wind, while we want it to be big, we want it to be fast, we also want it to be responsible. And for a long time, what we meant by that was that wildlife and habitat need to be stringently considered and protected every step of the way. But we've really expanded that definition to include all of the bolded text that you can see on the screen. Beyond wildlife and habitat, also consideration for other ocean users, consultation with Native American tribes and communities, engaging state and local governments and stakeholders, considering underserved communities, and ensuring science-based and stakeholder-informed decision-making. We believe that offshore wind can meet this bar, and we have a lot of examples to point to of where that is happening. But the crux of this is that we're hoping that offshore wind will be as big as it can be, and doing something that big can also have a lot of negative impact if it's not done well. And so while the early days of our offshore wind program were really geared toward selling offshore wind as a great idea and an important climate solution, most of our work today is around influencing and shaping how states and the federal government are approaching and regulating offshore wind development, hopefully always in a constructive manner. So the Biden administration really elevated the pace and scale of offshore wind endeavors nationally. Now, I will say in March 2021, when this 30 gigawatt by 2030 goal came out, and then more floating gigawatts were added to that as a goal last year, this was really just a recognition of what states had already done. States like New York and New Jersey and Massachusetts and Maryland and Virginia, setting large-scale offshore wind goals, setting these commitments, time-bound megawatt pursuits. The federal government really acknowledged and matched that, and that's critical. We can only advance offshore wind, as you all know, with the state and federal entities working in tandem. So for the first time, we really have a shared national pursuit and a sense of where and when these new endeavors will take place. So this has been really important to informing our advocacy. It's been really helpful. The map you can see on the screen is where the Biden administration indicated in this first term that they will build or intend to lease new areas for offshore wind development. That's been able to steer us to engage wildlife and community stakeholders in each of those regions to start building coalitions that will hopefully be able to influence the success of the industry in each of these places and ensure that it really meets the standard of responsible development. As excited as we are, and hopefully in our few minutes together, you have been able to glean that I am an offshore wind enthusiast myself, and I'm thrilled to see that there's finally a large-scale, fast-paced offshore wind goal ahead of us. It also brings with it really significant challenges to getting it done, as those of you in states pursuing offshore wind know very well that when you're trying to go big and go fast, it's really hard to gather the necessary baseline data to inform wildlife protective measures, because you need years of uninterrupted data to really make informed decisions on that front. And we have a lot of that, but we don't have everything that we need. And so we need to be nimble and adaptable. On the workforce and supply chain front, there's a huge gap to fill in workforce training and domestic manufacturing, and that's not something that can be stood up overnight. And then finally, on the community engagement front, building trust and buy-in from community stakeholders is something that just inherently takes time. So we have this trifecta of challenges ahead of us, and it really does require the participation of everyone who believes that this resource has an important role to play in our energy future, helping to really do what we can to go as fast as we can, and try to meet these challenges in a as effective of a way as possible. I'll just spend a couple of minutes on the threats to wildlife and how we address those specifically, particularly with fixed foundation platforms being considered and installed in most of the area off of the Atlantic coast. One of our greatest concerns is the underwater noise that comes with construction, particularly pile driving, hammering those foundations into the sea floor. And but we also have significant concern around the potential impact of vessel strikes being among the leading causes of death to marine mammals and sea turtles. Offshore wind will temporarily put more vessels on the water that will increase, again, temporarily, the risk of vessel strike for marine mammals. And I say this with caution and caveat because of the recent headlines I'm sure we'll get into potentially in the Q&A if there's interest, just around the concerning number of whale strandings along the Atlantic coast. And there is some concern around the increased number of vessels that offshore wind construction and operations will put on the water, and the fact that just inherently vessels on the water puts marine mammals at risk. So this is a potential impact for the construction phase that we take really seriously. It's not really something that we have much concern about around the surveying phase that is underway right now off of the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. But once we get into construction, vessel strikes really do come with an increased risk, and it's something that we have a lot of recommendations as to how to avoid and minimize and mitigate that impact. And then finally, collision risk. This is a avian, a bird and bat concern. Once the turbines are up and standing, if they're not in the right place, if they're not using deterrent technology, there's certainly impact that there will be collision with the operating turbine for avian species. So what we do is work with experts internally and at many, many partner organizations and compile comments and feedback on every single offshore wind proposal moving forward in the United States. We have a really robust coalition that's been working together for a decade now, and we detail our recommendations for how to avoid, minimize, mitigate, and monitor wildlife impacts at all stages of offshore wind development, from siting all the way through to decommissioning. We deliver those recommendations collectively at the federal level via the formal NEPA review and permitting process that plays out with many, many comment periods. We also bring those recommendations to officials at the state level, because ultimately states are the buyers of this power and have a lot, regardless of the fact that it's federal waters, there's a lot of influence that states can have in determining how offshore wind is built in federal waters, and can set those the same recommendations that we deliver into a federal docket, we can bring to folks writing state policy or writing a solicitation and ask them to set a higher bar than what is being required by the federal government, when what's being required federally is not meeting the standard necessary to sufficiently protect wildlife based on the latest science. And then finally, when we need that last sort of fine-tune adjustment, when there's anything left that sort of fall into the cutting room floor, we asked for a certain protective measure and didn't get it at the federal level, and then we asked for the state level and didn't achieve it, we'll go directly to developers and ask them to go above and beyond what's required of them to sufficiently protect, for example, North Atlantic right whales or an endangered or vulnerable marine or avian species that we're concerned about. And we've had some success in this regard as well. So when there maybe isn't sufficient science necessary to tip the scales on the regulatory side, we can occasionally get the buy-in of a developer to pilot a new monitoring technology, or just agree to slow down their vessels more than they need to. And of course, we deliver these comments. Those of you who are in the offshore wind space know this rainbow graphic well, but it's kind of the timeline we live within as soon as an offshore wind federal leasing and permitting process begins. So with each of the numbers in the colored bars indicating years of review, this is a sort of a sense of the stages and timelines at which we are able to provide those recommendations federally. I mentioned the influence that we try to bring at the state level. So here are a few just sort of advocacy successes or just wins that states have delivered on wildlife protection that allow us to really celebrate the way in which this industry is among both among the highest regulated activities operating offshore, and really something that we can say from a conservation organization perspective is operating responsibly, whether that's committing dollar amounts to invest in research and monitoring technology, or just committing to providing really detailed mitigation plans and allowing stakeholders to weigh in on those at an early stage. There's a lot that can, again, be done at the state level that can bring our regulation or bring our recommendations to bear. And then finally, I mentioned the direct to developer negotiations, and that's something that's really played out quite a bit regarding our concerns for the impact on potential impacts on North Atlantic right whales. And so just an example of success there, the South Fork Wind Farm to breaking ground soon and delivering power to Long Island. That project in particular, the developer reached an agreement with my organization, the National Wildlife Federation, as well as Conservation Law Foundation and NRDC, to go above and beyond and reduce their vessel speeds to 10 knots, a maximum of 10 knots at all vessels at all times, which is something that we know can go a long way in avoiding a fatal vessel strike with a marine mammal. I will note, it's only going to be 12 turbines. It's a lot easier to make that commitment when there are only 12 turbines. When we're talking about building 64, 80, 100 turbines for a project, these recommendations may not be viable, and that's where we'll need to advance different options. So it's something that was able to work with the South Fork Wind Farm, but we try to stay nimble and make recommendations that really fit each scenario. All right, that's all I've got for now. I look forward to answering any questions, and really thank you for the opportunity to talk with you tonight.
Thank you so much, Amber, and also for laying out the timeline so clearly in terms of how this is done, and also the different opportunities there are to advocate to make sure that the developers do this right, and there's certain policies in place to protect our wildlife. So really appreciate that, and know we'll get a lot of questions on that given the news. So we'll move right along to our next speaker, which is Atlantic County Commissioner, New Jersey, to Karen Fitzpatrick, who will talk a little bit about what's happening in her community in terms of jobs and the climate impacts related to offshore wind. Take it away, Karen.
Thanks, Dominic. Thank you very much for having me tonight. I always enjoy learning from my colleagues at EOPA about what's going on around the country regarding saving our environment. A lot of people have probably heard what's going on in New Jersey these days, where we have a wind farm being developed off of 15 miles off of Atlantic City. Atlantic City is on an island with 3 other towns that floods more and more often due to rising sea levels from climate change. And so our governor has really taken the bull by the horns and aggressively put New Jersey in a leadership position, really, as far as goals for offshore wind. As we heard, the state goal of is 11 gigawatts by 2040. New Jersey offshore wind could supply 92% of all of New Jersey's electricity needs. And our state goal is to have 100% clean energy by 2050. Let's see. Ocean Wind, that's the name of the first wind farm, is projected to reduce carbon emissions by 2.2 million tons. That's the equivalent of taking 400,000 cars off the road each year. So this is really a benefit for our community. We're in the southern part of New Jersey, and a lot of people think of New Jersey as what they see like on the beginning of The Sopranos or something like that, lots of traffic, lots of highways. But where we live, people would consider it rural, I think. So we don't have a lot of population. And we need the jobs that are going to come from this new industry. We're always talking about diversifying our economy away from gaming, not totally leaving gaming, but it can't support our folks the way that they should be supported. And so wind energy is going to do that. We are going to be investing a total of $150 billion in New Jersey. Our local community college, Atlantic Cape, was awarded a $2.9 million grant to build, open, and educate our local folks in repair and maintenance of the turbines. Very, very important. These jobs don't require a college degree, and they pay upwards of about $70,000 to $100,000 a year. The Technical High School, Atlantic County Institute of Technology, received a $1.5 million grant to do offshore wind career development, again, right out of high school with a certificate to do maintenance and repair on the turbines. A big focus of our county is to expand the use of our airport. We have a very underutilized airport, and it's a place where experimentation is done. There's an FAA tech center attached to it, and it's been there for probably about 60 or 70 years. They're working on expanding the airport to include maintenance, also aircraft maintenance. And one of the good things, one of the unintended consequences of wind energy that I didn't think of is repairing a wind turbine is a very similar skill set to repairing an airplane engine. So people are going to have, the two industries complement each other is what I'm trying to say. Additionally, further inland, Salem County, which is on the Delaware Bay across from Philadelphia, is uniquely situated to where they're going to be manufacturing the parts of the turbines right there. They are investing $500 million in what's being called the wind port. They're right on the bay, as I mentioned, and the parts of the turbines can go right on a barge and float right out to sea to where the turbines are going to be located with no impediments, no bridges in the way, no highways, and it's a very unusual situation. I'm just so happy about this because finally, New Jersey is uniquely qualified to do this. I'm very, very pleased. I read a quote today that said, the wind energy industry is the best thing to come out of New Jersey since the boss. So that's Bruce. So we're very, very excited. Most of us, 92% of us. But some people are not very excited. We're having some pushback. Started out with views from the beach. And then unfortunately, when the tragedy of the whales beaching and dying started happening, they kind of latched onto that to move the agenda forward. And, you know, now it's our job as elected officials to tell the truth and try and help people understand what misinformation is out there that they may be hearing, and give them the facts, the real facts, not alternative facts, and try and quell their fears. You know, people are fearful, and that makes them angry, and we can deal with that with education. So that's where we are in Atlantic County. As far as the shipping lanes are concerned, one additional cause that I have learned recently is there are labor issues on the West Coast. We've heard of that, the longshoremen, and that is causing additional traffic to the ports of New York and New Jersey, making our waterways even more crowded than they already were. So that is another reason why we are having some boat ship strikes on the whales. We are just looking forward to this continuing. We're going to start producing energy in a year, which is very quick, and it's going to be great for the whole region. We're going to be able to power enough homes. Really, it's the lower half of the state. That's kind of how rural we are here, with the wind farm that is coming to us now, and it's very, very exciting for so many reasons. Thanks, Dominic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Commissioner Fitzpatrick, for sharing that and really highlighting the economic benefits for a community like yours that has the opportunity to diversify its economy and really bring in jobs and revenue in a way that a lot of rural communities really don't have the opportunity to before an industry that has so many co-benefits like offshore wind can do. So thank you so much for sharing that, and for also showing how important it is to dive into this topic as an elected official and become informed as a policymaker so we could play a productive role. And last but not least, we'd love to move on to our last speaker, who's an East Hampton New York, council member in Long Island, Kate Rogers, who will talk a little bit about what's happening in her community in terms of the build out from jobs and how you're working as a community liaison with offshore wind.
Yes, thank you, Dominic,
Rogers.
and thanks to EOPA for this opportunity to speak this evening. My perspective, we had our local electric grid was not able to support peak demand, so there was an RFP put out. East Hampton is on the eastern end of Long Island. It is a tourist community, so our peak demand is mostly in the summer. We go from, well, pre-pandemic numbers, we're more in the area of 22,000 year-round residents and then over 100,000 during the season. So the energy demands, what the old grid that we have here was not able to keep up with our demands. And we were having peaker plants, which sound like something green, but are actually diesel plants on trucks supplying extra power to us. In 2015, the Long Island Power Authority put out an RFP for additional power to meet this demand and the growing demand across Long Island. There were a number of proposals for building fossil fuel plants distances away from Long Island where we wouldn't see them. In frontline communities, and that's where for me the environmental justice portion of this comes in. And they got one proposal for a wind farm 35 miles east of Montauk, not visible to our town whatsoever. And where East Hampton came in was we had to grant the authority for an easement, a road opening easement and an easement so that the cable can be brought onshore underneath the beach in Wainscott and travel 2.5 miles to a new substation that LIPA is building next to their current substation. There'll be enough energy. It is a smaller project than the NYSERDA projects. It's the first project besides after Block Island, so the first New York project. And it'll power approximately 77,000 homes, which is very significant out here as our energy demands constantly increase, especially if we're looking to electrify our state. So this is all really important. We also have a traditional fishing industry. So that's something local folks, the year-round population lives at or above the poverty line. So protecting that industry and fishermen's rights is also important. So one of the false flags you come across is people like to put you in a category. If you're for offshore wind, you're against fishing. If you're for this, you're against that. You don't care about the environment. And actually, if you do care about the environment and fishing, then you know the need to transition to renewable energy. Our onshore construction, Ørsted and Eversource are the partners that are doing our project. Before I was an elected official, I was elected in 2021. My term started in 2022. I was a community organizer. I also was a founding member of a pro South Fork Wind advocacy group. So as part of that advocacy, two things. Dispel the constant misinformation that was being put across about the wind farm, its impacts both onshore and offshore to our community, and also to make sure that the developer did everything right, because we do live here and we are part of this community. And we realize that if it's not done right, it won't be done anyplace else. So the onshore construction part started last year. They have a window of January to April. I was a party to the proceedings throughout the Article 7 process. This wind farm went through the process before the new siting bureau, so it had to go through the full Article 7 process. The town of East Hampton was also a party to the proceeding, and we watched this construction and management plan develop over 2.5 years. The construction started in January. I was elected, and I am the liaison to the project, to the South Fork Wind project. So My job is to make sure that they're complying with all of our easement requirements, as well as all the state requirements, and dealing with any impacts into the community, complaints from residents during construction. This is the second year of construction. They've actually now laid the cable, pulled it on shore with a horizontal directional drilling, went 50 feet under the beach. The beach was not impacted whatsoever, under the parking lot of the beach, and came out on Beach Lane, a very narrow country lane. There was very few road closures or detours. There was always one access lane for emergency vehicles, for folks wanting to go down to the beach. No transportation was ever debilitated. No access to anywhere in town was ever debilitated during this 2-year construction project. They are not allowed to work during our tourist season. So they have January to April, September to, again, through April to do their onshore work. I can say that since I've had this experience, I wish every project that came into town had the same kind of compliance requirements and oversight. I have bi-weekly meetings with the construction team in which they have to tell us about any complaints and how they resolve them. They also have to let us know if they've come across any endangered species and what they did in terms of remedy and making sure that that endangered species was protected. Onshore, when they were working on the LIRR right-of-way, the cable transverses the LIRR right-of-way in some spots. They did come across a protected turtle species. I immediately got a notification. The state was immediately notified. The DEC was immediately notified, and all construction stopped until the turtle left the area, which took over a day, I believe, for it to walk along outside the area. So these are, I'm just talking about this as what my actual experience has been in watching this onshore cable be laid under our streets, under our beaches to connect to our substation. I wish every road project actually had as much compliance and overview. We have a monthly meeting with the state, every state agency, from Parks and Recreation to DOT to DEC and all environmental protection agencies of the state are on the call, and they must give a full report. They had to hire a separate compliance company to make sure that they complied with every aspect of the permit, an environmental compliance agency, and an outreach agency for any residents that had any issues with the construction. Our biggest issue so far where a subcontractor accidentally cutting through a cable line to someone's home. That was repaired by 5 o'clock that day. And that's about the worst complaint we had with this full construction project onshore. It is a very large scale project. There's a lot of details that are worked out by the state agencies in advance. And it has really been an exemplary experience. As I said, I wish all the projects that I oversee were held to such compliance and had so many eyes on it, not just from the state, not just from our local government, but also from our residents who were really afraid of what was going to happen to Wainscott, and if this quiet country hamlet was going to be changed forever by this cable coming ashore. The trench is about 18 inches wide. It takes up 1 lane. We tend to use these very big words like cable trench, and I think of, you know, a giant trench going through a mountain, but it's really has been an educational experience on compliance and on a very good construction project. We are meant to power up this year, and I'm very excited about that. So thank you for this opportunity to talk about my experience.
Wonderful. Thank you, Council Member, for sharing that contribution and also the firsthand knowledge of, okay, this is what offshore wind infrastructure build out looks like. It's It can be compatible with local communities, and it's good to know that the responsible developers have an interest to make sure that they're responding to community concerns. And really the point that you made about this is not an either or dichotomy between communities and fisheries or offshore wind, but that we need to make sure that we make it an and. Yes, fisheries and communities and offshore wind done together to make sure that we're responsive to the needs of those fishery communities and other stakeholders, and also the constant disinformation that is frankly intentional by interests that want to prevent this industry, as well as media types that are that have an interest in disinformation. So the importance of getting out in front and conversations like this one, so we can get facts and respond to that disinformation. Speaking of which, responding, we've already have a number of questions coming in. We'll move to the Q&A portion. The first one is a very pointed question for Amber and your experience on offshore wind and wildlife. So there's been mentions of whale deaths in the media. Is there any tangible evidence for connection to offshore wind, or is this simply an opposition talking point?
Yeah, thank you. Expected the question, so glad to be kicking it off with this topic. The answer is, for these particular instances, is pretty simple, in that the activity that's happening offshore, this early pre-construction survey activity, does not, and this is something that we analyze closely in the both proposed activity and then track the activity as it's happening, does not present concern for whale fatalities. The whales that have been able to be evaluated, that haven't been too decomposed for a necropsy, they're indicating that they suffered fatal vessel strikes, among other just challenges of being a whale in the ocean. Vessel strikes is the leading cause of death for whales in the Atlantic, for marine mammals and sea turtles, along with the significant ongoing impact of entanglement with fishing gear. So, but noting that the whales that we have been able to gather evaluations for have indicated vessel strikes, the survey activity that's taking place offshore right now does not present a risk of vessel strike, given both the slow speed of these vessels and the fact that they're all required to have trained species observers on board, and none have reported vessel strikes. The best way to produce a vessel strike right now, or to reduce vessel strikes, is to slow down, and these are slow vessels. That said, so for this instance, the whale strandings that have been reported in the past couple of months now, there's no reason to believe that they have any connection to the offshore wind pre-construction and survey activity that's happening right now. I think it is manipulation of a really tragic reality that it's pretty dangerous to be a whale in the Atlantic Ocean. And the number of whales that have turned up in the past couple of months are within the range of normal, which is really sad. And but it's a trend that began well before offshore wind survey activity was taking place offshore. So we know what kills whales. We know that human interaction, whether it's vessel strikes or fishing gear entanglement, as well as warming waters, changing whales' migratory patterns, this has been killing whales for far too long. And those are the things that we need to take really seriously. I think pointing to offshore wind survey activity as, significantly enhancing the risk, or clearly spreading conspiracy theories that there's a connection here, is actually distracting from the things that really need to, if there's this much, and I hope there is this much concern out there around whales stranding on beaches, then we need to take the impacts that we understand really seriously. And as we go forward, I mentioned in my presentation, offshore wind construction does include some high-speed vessel traffic, getting crews back and forth to and from project sites. And so we need to recognize that will, at that stage, increase the risk that whales are facing. And that's where we need developers like I mentioned with South Fork Wind, the project that we just heard about from Kate. They committed to slowing down their vessels, all vessels at all times, to 10 knots or slower, to reduce the potential impact of vessel strikes to whales. We hope that more developers will be able to slow down, as well as to advance real-time monitoring technology that can allow vessels to know when whales are in the area and to reactively slow down. There's a lot of work happening in this space. And so I'm glad that there's a lot of interest and juice around it. I don't think that it means we need to slow down offshore wind development, but it means that we really do need to make sure that all industries operating in the ocean are taking seriously their impact on marine mammals and sea turtles. And offshore wind is going to need to be a responsible actor as well, but it's not an offshore wind specific problem.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amber. And we'll note that at least 3 different government agencies have dispelled the notion that there's any connection, including NOAA coming out quite definitively saying there's no connection. So thank you for sharing that. We have another question that's to both Kate and Karen, which is both East Hampton and Atlantic City see a lot of influx of visitors in the summer. How much do local businesses want offshore wind?
I work in tourism. It's my day job, and I haven't heard any negativity from any local businesses. We've heard, from the homeowners who were concerned with their view that it would impact their rental business and possibly their property value. But if you look at Zillow in Rhode Island from when Block Island started and to now, property values increased just like they always did. And I think it'll be almost like a curiosity. Additionally, recreational fishing will be made better because the platforms, et cetera, act like an artificial reef and provide a place for the fish to gather. So, and I think along with ecotourism, which we're really trying to promote, and we're islands and on the shore here, I think it'll be an attraction, a positive. And I haven't heard seriously any negatives from any businesses.
And for us on the East End, one of the biggest concerns while the project was developing was, we have one main east-west route throughout our town, and that's about it. And that, of course, I think the traffic is famous here, hours and hours of sitting in traffic on the weekends as people are coming to enjoy things here. Once it was decided that where the route was coming in and that it would not impact that large east-west route, which would have taken them 2.5 years to do instead of 18 months on a north-south route, we had a big support from our businesses here. They want the electricity. They don't want the brownouts. We were experiencing brownouts. So, having to shut your air conditioning off in the summer does not attract tourists or customers. So, anything that can enhance the grid here is welcome. An industry, local industry here that's very important to me as well is the fishing industry. And I think that's where the naturally and appropriate largest concern was impacts of the fishermen here. With being unable to access their fishing grounds, and sighting was extremely important. What happens if their equipment gets snagged and they lose equipment? All of that has been a big bone of contention, a big fear group, and I understand that. And I think that their fears should be dealt with as well, and the developers are dealing with that, and they are offering compensation for any lost work time. But we also are seeing here a tremendous impact to our fisheries as ocean acidification and warm waters happen here. Our very important bay scallop industry, where a lot of local folks made their money, that's been dead for 3 years due to climate change. The fishermen off of Montauk, what they find is that they have to go further and further north for the fisheries. The flounders are moving, the lobsters have already left. The Montauk lobsters, we were famous for it. They're losing their incomes because of what's happening. So, if if we don't do something, these industries won't exist. As far as being Amazons at Montauk, we've had whales, unfortunately, wash up on our shores for years. Fish entanglements, vessel strikes, it never seemed to get the attention that they're getting now. And one of the things that really surprised me when I looked at the shipping industry, if you look at a shipping industry map, there's more shipping going on than there are cars on our turnpikes. So I applaud Amber for her efforts to get every industry to be aware of what's happening as the waters warm and acidification happens, driving all of these mammals into areas where they normally don't look for food.
Thank you, Kate, for sharing that, and a really important point about the climate impacts as well, and just the need to get off of fossil fuels, which is of course not covered in the media when we're talking about this, of just how the impact of ocean acidification on wildlife. And to Karen as well, your point about the opportunities that wind turbines out in the offshore create. In Maine, they've created a wind turbine that can grow $1 million worth of mussels to actually help supplement the income. So it can actually create a diversity of income sources. So actually on the boats question, was another question that we had come in. Just how much more boat traffic, shipping traffic will offshore wind create? How many more vessels relative to what the current baseline is? It's a question for maybe Kate or Amber.
Well, I can comment on baseline. I don't know if I can fully answer this question right now, but what I can say is that right now, offshore wind vessels account for fewer than 2% of vessels offshore in the region. Whereas I think an important note here is that oil and gas tankers account for about 40% of the vessels operating off of our region, off of the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. And so while there will be, and I also think an important note here is that the survey and construction vessels involved in building offshore wind are temporary to build a resource that will then serve the region for upwards of 25, 30 years, and require only intermittent maintenance trips. I mean, there will be, ongoing visits to the site by crew transfer vessels, but the bulk of the vessel activity around construction is very temporary. Whereas if you're relying on oil and gas, that's a forever pursuit, right? We need oil and gas tankers transporting those resources constantly with no break, with no intermittency. And so if we can get to the place that we're trying to get to with large scale renewables, ultimately building offshore wind will displace the need for that much oil and gas activity on the ocean. So I've been really trying to deliver this message around the whale strandings in particular, because while there is going to be temporarily increased vessel traffic from offshore wind construction, in the bigger picture, it hopefully will significantly reduce our reliance on imported oil and gas and remove some of that vessel traffic that's out there now.
Great, thank you. And Kate, did you want a chance to jump in on that?
I would just say that for the cable installation, bringing it onshore with a horizontal directional drilling under the seabed, under the beach, under the road, there was one lift boat, a very large lift boat, and what that is it sails here as a vessel and then lifts on these gigantic legs completely out of the water, and one very large barge to assist it. Any construction project, whether you're on land or on the sea, is going to add a larger amount of vehicles in that area. But I really think that when I agree completely with what Amber said. We're just east of New York Harbor. The traffic that comes into there and out of there on a daily basis that crosses the Atlantic Ocean is phenomenal. So, as people are advocating for offshore wind to do the right thing, and as an industry, we have to keep, our foots on their throats to make sure they do the right thing, but we should also be including every industry.
Thank you. Excellent point. And I think also what Amber, what you said about, and we'd love to see the statistics for that if we can share around the studies about the 2% of vessel traffic being offshore wind compared to 40% for oil and gas, I think speaks to a lot of just about the environmental impacts and frankly the benefits, multiple benefits of offshore wind production, and the importance of getting out facts to counter some of the disinformation that's frankly very much aligned with fossil fuel interests, preventing these projects from happening. There's a question that's come in and asking about jobs for frontline communities. How do we ensure that these jobs are actually going towards communities that would benefit the most from them?
Well, as I mentioned, we built and started 2 different training programs, one at the community college and one at the county high school. The community college is in Atlantic City, which is a majority minority city. And the whole idea is to be able to certify and educate people who live in the city to work in the city and do the work that is necessary. I'm pretty certain there are some percentages in agreement that will be adhered to as far as employing city residents, because the unemployment rate in the city is very high. So where there's going to be opportunity for people there's going to be opportunity for training, and the jobs are going to be able to sustain a family, which is very important to all of us.
One of the biggest supporters groups that supported the South Fork Wind Farm project was the Long Island Federation of Labor and the ACA, I'm going to get this wrong, or all organized labor, electricians, every construction job supported this, because Long Island, and I'll speak to the larger picture, Long Island was built on Grumman, on industries that came to Long Island, and they've all gone. So you don't have any large scale construction projects, electrical, that require electricians, engineers, every single avenue. I think the governor's commitment to union jobs and prevailing wage, which is extremely important, helps with dispersing jobs to the people that need the jobs, along with the new training at the community colleges here for wind farm technician for a totally new profession. So with any new industry, you see job creation, and the prevailing wage, the unions, all of that is very important to making sure that the influx of job creation goes to the right places.
Excellent. And I think we have time for one more question. And thanks for that information about the jobs, and very helpful to understand what's going on the ground. Last question being, we're talking a lot about coastal communities and the impacts of climate change. How has the climate crisis impacted your communities, and what do you see the benefits of offshore wind in relation to the climate crisis?
Well, we're an island and shore communities, and we flood all the time. Used to be full moon, high tide once a month. Now it's very common. If there's a decent rain, we're flooding. There's nowhere for the water to go. There's too much concrete. The water has risen, and it's really a situation that's impacting people in their daily lives. I live on what we call the mainland. I work in Atlantic City, and pretty often I have to turn around because the road I want to take is flooded. Children in Atlantic City in the Back Bay area, which should get more attention than the beachfront because it floods more often and stays flooded longer than incoming tides. Children are unable to get to school because they're flooded into their houses. They can't get out. It's very concerning. The major economic driver of our county is our gaming industry. They're all on the island. And if flooding becomes too detrimental, they're going to leave. So that's a lot of employment. That's like 20,000 people. And we have to mitigate that. We have to figure out how to lessen the sea level rise, and impact the ways to keep the water off the island, and start using permeable substances to pave and allow water to go where it needs to go when it does rain and the tide does come up. It affects us in our daily lives.
Yes, Karen, we're also a coastal community, and we're greatly impacted by the impacts of the climate crisis. We've, as a town, a government declared a climate crisis here in our town, and all of our policy decisions will take that into consideration. Our pine forests, thousands of trees are being decimated by the southern pine beetle. In our state parks, where we've lost so much of our forest, our natural forest, to the southern pine beetle. We don't have winters anymore. We're seeing, as I said, die off of fisheries in our bays and migration of fisheries off of our coast. We have sunny day high tides, the king tides that Karen was talking about, are becoming more and more frequent. During storm surges, the water is going higher than it ever has gone before. And the impacts go on and on. The tick population is multiplying unfettered because we don't have winters anymore. There's I've lived out on Long Island my whole life. I've lived in this town for over 20 years, and you could see the strain on all the environment and all the living things out here with the climate crisis and the warming waters. So we don't have time to waste. And the benefits of renewable energy is, I think this has been a decided matter. 99 point, I think it's now 9% of the world scientists agree that, you know, climate change is caused by greenhouse gases, the burning of fossil fuels. And the only way to mitigate worse changes coming down the line is to as quick as possible, get off of fossil fuels and transition to renewable energy.
Great. Well, thank you, Kate. And so with that, we will thank our panelists so much for sharing their expertise and knowledge with us and their experiences on the ground as this emergency, climate emergency is happening, but more importantly, this emerging industry is such an important part of our future for our economy, our jobs, our public health, and our protecting our people and our planet. So we'll thank our panelists. We'll ask our panelists to stay on just for a minute, and we'll let the rest of our guests go. And thank you so much for coming and attending this webinar, and look forward to seeing you on March 1st as well.